Thanks for attending this talk. I'm Shuo Chen of Microsoft Research Asia. This is a joint work with Tsinghua University. The team includes our students Zihao Jing, Ziqiao, and Professor Haixin Duan. The title is Timing-Based Browsing Privacy Vulnerabilities via Site Isolation. Let me first explain what site isolation is. You may know that before Chromium, all commercial browsers were monolithic. They were single-process programs. I think Chromium's multiprocess architecture is the deepest rethinking about the security architecture for modern browsers. Between 2008, when Chrome was released, and 2018, when site isolation was achieved, it took a whole decade for the architecture to achieve site isolation, which ensures that A.com's contents and B.com's contents are rendered by two processes. It was a long journey which also involved many academic papers. And eventually in 2019, Google published the site isolation paper in Usenix Security. Site isolation requires a huge effort to overcome compatibility, resource, and performance hurdles. The security benefit is also significant. The Chrome team showed that many well-known security issues are mitigated in a fundamental way, including memory exploits, universal cross-site scripting, browser extension security issues, and meltdown and spectra. But there is still a problem. We know that the web is extremely complex, but process is a scarce resource in the OS. How can this scarce resource accommodate the complex web? For example, a typical CNN news page contains at least 15 cross-site iframes. Because different sites must be rendered by different processes, one CNN page needs at least 16 processes for site isolation. Now suppose I have 10 tabs in my browser. Does Chrome use 160 processes to render these 10 CNN tabs? That would not be practical. So process scarcity is an inherent challenge for site isolation. To make site isolation feasible, same-size frames need to aggressively reuse processes even across tabs. So for example, it is possible that the 10 CNN tabs in the previous slide are rendered by 16 processes. And this leads to the privacy issue we discover in this work. We call this privacy issue cross-site browsing privacy leak. The attack scenario is the following. Suppose the user visits the attacker's site or any site containing the attacker's script. The attacker has a target site list which contains hundreds or a few thousands of sensitive sites. Then the attacker can find out which sites are loaded in the browser, and furthermore, the attacker can monitor how the user spends time between these sensitive sites. And in particular, at any moment, the attacker can figure out which site is in the foreground tab and which sites are in the background tabs. Here is a demo about the attacker monitoring a target site.
In this video, I will show how to play with the demo. First, specify a site or choose it from the list. For example, YouTube. Click Monitor and immediately switch another tab. Ignore the first result. Now you see the not present result, meaning that the attacker knows YouTube.com is not present. Now I visit YouTube. The attacker now knows that YouTube is in the foreground tab. I switch to another tab. The attacker now knows that YouTube is in a background tab. I switch to foreground. I switch to background. I switch to foreground. And I switch to background. I close YouTube. Now it is not present. Thank you for watching.
So how can the attacker see which sites are present and which sites you are interacting with? What actually happened is that the attacker's page contains an iframe to load a YouTube URL. The attacker can measure the time of the loading. If the time is long, YouTube is likely not present. Otherwise, it is likely present. This is because if YouTube is in another tab, the attacker's iframe will reuse the existing process. Otherwise, it will create a new process. The difference is tens of milliseconds, which is very big. We measure each of Alexa top 3000 sites in the not present, foreground, and background situations, or MP, FG, BG. The red BG and the blue MP distributions are clearly different. The green FP distribution is very wide, so we have FG and MP overlapping, also FG, BG overlapping. To deal with the overlappings, we identify other timing characteristics to differentiate FG versus BG and FG versus MP. For FG versus BG, we find that Chromium assigns a high process priority to the FG process. If the attacker stresses the CPU with an infinite loop, the FG process performance will be impacted less significantly than a BG process. As you can see, these dots can be separated along the vertical dimension, which is about the second measurement on a stressed CPU. For FG versus MP, we find that the HTML parsing performance is lower when a process is newly created. So the attacker can measure the HTML parsing time to test if it is an MP. The result is similar. We can now separate the blue and green dots that couldn't separate along the first dimension. I just talked about the high-level idea. There are many details to make the idea really work. I'm now describing some details. The first detail is about avoiding network jitters. The attacker is based on inter-process timing, so we do not want the network to affect the timing. There are two ways to load a URL without generating an actual network request. The first way is to use an unsafe port in the URL, such as port 1, port 22, etc. For example, we let the iframe load YouTube on port 1. This request is prohibited by the browser because port 1 is considered an unsafe port. However, because the request is prohibited, the iframe loading is completed immediately, and this gives us no network delay in the measurement. The second way is to use a static content in the disk cache. For example, the attacker can preload favicon.ico or robot.txt So this static resource is in the disk cache. Then when the attacker does the actual measurement, there is no network delay in the result. The second set of details is about understanding Chromium's internals. We explore Chromium's internals to find and understand the timing characteristics. This was achieved through design docs and source code, through the IPC layer investigation, and through our runtime testing. The paper describes many details. For example, we talk about inter-process communication. We also focus on the code logic about render view, which has an interesting cross-iframe effect related to the page's visibility. In addition, we talk about the HTML parsing performance, which is affected by the freshness of the renderer process. These are sources that produce timing differences, but I need to skip these details in my talk today. Let me now present the evaluation results. We use the Alexa Top 3000 sites to do an evaluation to cover different CPU powers and different noise workload levels. Specifically, we test on a more powerful desktop PC and a less powerful laptop PC. We create different numbers of extra tabs loading arbitrary pages as noise. We have 4 datasets. Dataset A is the scenario with 5 extra tabs on the desktop PC, and dataset B is 1 extra tab on desktop PC. Dataset C is 1 extra tab on laptop PC, and dataset D is 5 extra tabs on laptop PC. You can see that the results of these 4 datasets show the similar concept, which is that different colors can be separate. And then for most overlapping dots, the second measurement can separate them. We measure the pairwise differentiation rate, and these are the average results. They are pretty high. We compiled many versions of Chromium for testing. All the green versions are not vulnerable, and all the red versions are vulnerable. The first vulnerable version is this one, which is the version in 2018 that enabled site isolation. Edge is confirmed vulnerable because it uses Chromium. Firefox is a little different. It uses the Gecko engine, not Chromium. Project Fission of Mozilla is an experimental feature for site isolation on Firefox. We do the first experiment about MP and BG. They can also be separated easily. However, the second measurement will require a deeper understanding about the implementation. We haven't spent the effort to dig into the details. You may notice that the dots on this diagram appear to be quantized among the time dimension. This is because Firefox lowers the precision of JavaScript's timing API to 1 millisecond in order to defend against meltdown and spectral attack. This is just an interesting side note I want to mention. To summarize, site isolation introduces a reliable timing channel that discloses a user's site visiting behavior. The main challenge is the tension between the scarcity of processes and the objective to separate cross-site frames in different processes. In this paper, we talk about our discussions with the Edge and Chrome teams about potential mitigations. One possible mitigation proposed by the Chrome team is to prohibit process reuse between a top-level frame and an iframe. We will see whether this reuse policy gets into the Chromium code in the future. Now, I'm stopping here and ready to answer your questions.
Okay. Sorry, I have a cool down time for the microphone. So if anyone has a question, please use the microphone and state your name and affiliation. And okay, different person, sorry. So I guess you're the first author. Okay, if, while you warm up, I have a question. There is one thing I didn't understand. So to remove the network latency, basically, you have this trick that you load something from the cache, for example, the icon or the robot.txt, which is pretty cool. But then later you say that one of the source of the timing difference is the HTML parser. But you don't actually render the HTML in your tab, right? So you only load like an icon. So why would the HTML parser affect the timing difference?
Hi, thank you for interest in our work. So actually, the HTML parser is involved when the arrow page is rendered. So we use the unsafe port, which will result in an arrow page being rendered in the iframe, since the arrow page is composed in HTML. So that process will involve a lot of HTML parsing and will add latency to the loading time.
But that will introduce a latency, like a delay in the original page, which is open in the other tab, not in the one you're measuring the time that loads, right?
It will involve a latency when during the iframe loading process, and that latency depends on whether there is a background tab or not, and whether it's newly started or not.
Okay. Questions? We're already 1 minute late, so I think we can stop here. If you can please check online if you have also other questions, so you can ask them maybe, you can answer maybe them offline. And in this meantime, we can ask the second speaker to, yeah. Thank you very much.